I want to tell you something about the dead. Not the ones we bury, we handle those with ceremony, with names spoken aloud, with the proper weight of grief. I mean the ones we dismiss, the ones we declare finished before we've properly looked at them, the ones we walk past for years because we've decided collectively that there's nothing left there worth our attention. The Vardy's command throne sat in a hole in the ground for 14,000 years, and in all that time, not one person stopped to wonder if it was waiting. My name is Dara Osai. I was 31 years old when it spoke to me. I was a Grade 3 logistics coordinator attached to the 9th Colonial Garrison Survey, which is a long way of saying I moved boxes on paper. I tracked equipment manifests. I reconciled supply counts against delivery receipts. When things went missing, and things always went missing on active dig sites, in active conflict zones, where discipline ran thin and soldiers got inventive, I was the one who followed the trail of numbers until I found where they'd gone. I was not a soldier. I had never fired a weapon in active combat. I had no bloodline I knew of that carried any particular distinction, no lineage that anyone had bothered to document past my great-grandmother's name scratched into a colonial census form. My mother ran a dry goods supply route on the Merv corridor. Her mother before her had worked the same route. We were women who moved things from one place to another and kept careful count. That is what I was when I walked into the Vardy's excavation chamber on the morning of the 14th day of our survey deployment. That is what I still was when I walked out. But I knew something different by then, and the throne knew it too. I need to back up. I need to give you the shape of the place before I give you the moment, because the moment makes no sense without the shape, and the shape was extraordinary even before anything happened in it. The planet we were surveying, we called it Orance Rock, after the lead geologist, a dry, practical woman named Commander Ussel Orant who had no patience for romanticism, was not supposed to contain anything of significance. The Confederation Survey database listed it as a Category 4 uninhabited landmass, mineral traces, stable atmosphere, no indigenous life, no prior colonial infrastructure. Standard pre-settlement scan. We were there to verify the subsurface composition before a civilian mining consortium submitted its license application. What Orant's initial ground-penetrating scans found instead was a structure. Not a small structure, not an anomalous rock formation that registered as architectural on a careless readout. A structure, deliberate, geometric, vast, buried under approximately 40 meters of sediment and compressed volcanic deposit. The outer walls, once the first excavation shaft broke through, were not stone. They were a substance that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, cool and smooth, and carrying the faint residual warmth that, the engineers told us later, comes from materials that have been in sustained slow operation for an extremely long time. The corridor beyond those walls was 11 meters high. The glyphwork carved into the walls ran unbroken from floor to ceiling, dense as woven cloth, and it was old in a way that the geologists kept having trouble describing. Not old as in several thousand years. Old as in the sediment that had buried it was itself ancient, and this structure had been here before that sediment formed. The official Confederation Archaeological Services team arrived on day 4. They brought 23 researchers, a full documentation unit, 4 armed escorts, and the kind of institutional excitement that, in my experience, only the academic branches of Confederation service ever managed to generate. A buzzing, almost childish energy that cut through the usual fatigue of field deployment and made people talk too fast. I processed their equipment manifests when they landed. I noted the calibration dates on their instruments. I verified their security clearances and matched them to the garrison's access logs. I did my job. What I noticed, doing my job, was that the ranked officers kept going down into the site and coming back changed. Not obviously, not dramatically, but I process numbers for a living, and numbers are patterns, and human behavior is a pattern too if you watch it long enough. Commander Orant went down on day 5 for an initial review, she said. She was in the main excavation chamber for 3 hours. When she came back, she was quieter. She filed her reports on time and correctly, but she stopped saying unnecessary things. She had been the kind of officer who communicated in full sentences with context and subordinate clauses. After day 5, she gave instructions in the minimal possible words. Colonel Harvin went down on day 7. He commanded the garrison's primary combat unit, a lean, certain man who had built a career on decisive action and the confidence of someone who had never been surprised by anything important. He was in the excavation chamber for 4 hours. When he returned, he didn't look uncertain. Harvin was constitutionally incapable of uncertainty. But he looked, for the first time in my observation of him, like a man who had encountered something he could not resolve into a category he already possessed. He said nothing about it to anyone I talked to. He requested the site access logs for all prior entries and read them twice. Major Less went down on day 9, stayed for 5 hours, and came back asking questions about the glyph documentation that suggested she had been trying to touch something and had found that she couldn't. By the end of day 10, the unofficial consensus among the garrison personnel, the kind of consensus that forms in mess halls and supply staging areas, not in official briefings, was that the structure's main chamber contained something the ranked people kept trying to activate, and that it wasn't cooperating. I heard the word thrown for the first time on day 11. One of the junior archaeological researchers, a young man named Save Madre, used it when he thought he was out of earshot in the equipment staging corridor outside my logistics office. He was talking to one of his colleagues, a woman whose name I never learned, and he said, "It's a throne. Nobody argues about that anymore. The whole room was built around it. It's sitting on a raised platform in the center, and everything in the chamber faces it. The question is why it won't respond." His colleague said something I didn't catch. Save said, all of them, Orant, Harvin, Less, both of the archaeology leads, everyone who's gone in has tried, it doesn't do anything, just sits there and pulls the light in. I went back to my manifests. On day 12, the Confederation Archaeological Services Unit submitted a formal request through Garrison Command for expanded excavation access and an extended survey period. The request included a preliminary summary of findings that I was required to log, receipt, and forward to Regional Command. I read it as part of the logging process, the way I read everything that passed through my station. The summary said that the structure was pre-Confederation by a significant margin. The preliminary dating estimates ranged from 11 to 15,000 years, and that the main chamber appeared to be a command or ceremonial space of considerable scale. The central feature was a throne-form structure made of the same light-absorbing material as the outer walls, approximately 4 meters tall at the back of the chair, with glyphs covering its entire surface and what appeared to be an active but dormant energy system within it. Multiple attempts at interaction and activation had produced no response. The material was not damaged. The energy readings were consistent and stable. The structure appeared, in the assessment of the survey team's senior researchers, to be functioning exactly as intended. It was simply not responding to the people who had approached it. The summary ended with a line that I read twice. The artifact appears to be waiting. For what or for whom remains undetermined. I filed the report. I updated the manifest. I went to sleep that night in the garrison's temporary habitat unit and lay on my bunk for a while, looking at the curved inner wall of the module, thinking about a word. Waiting. Not broken. Not dormant in the way a depleted power cell is dormant. Not sealed by entropy or damage. Waiting with intent. The way a locked door waits for the right key, not the way a door waits because nobody has opened it in a while. I thought about that for longer than I should have. Day 13 was a supply reconciliation day. The archaeological team had been drawing heavily on our garrison's consumable stocks, lighting arrays. excavation ceiling compound, documentation media, and I needed to physically verify the sub-storage inventory against the records to resolve a discrepancy that had been sitting in my system for 6 days. This took most of the day and led me through several corridors of the garrison's temporary infrastructure that I didn't normally have reason to visit. It also led me, because the garrison's portable storage units had been staged somewhat haphazardly in the initial deployment, and nobody had reorganized them, through the access corridor that led to the excavation site's primary entry shaft. I resolved the discrepancy. Sub-storage Unit 7 was carrying 12 fewer lighting array units than the manifest said because someone had pulled them for the chamber's interior work and logged them against the wrong account code. I corrected it. I filed the correction, and I stood in the access corridor for a moment, looking at the entry shaft's hatch, which was unsecured during survey hours. I am not an impulsive person. I make decisions based on information and I weigh available options carefully. But I had been thinking about the word waiting for most of the previous night, and the shaft was open, and I had full site clearance. Logistics coordinators carry full clearance on dig deployments because they need to be able to reach any piece of equipment at any location, and it was the end of the active survey shift, which meant the chamber was empty. I went down the shaft. The ladder was 15 meters. The shaft itself was the work of the expedition's first 2 days, freshly cut, rough-sided, smelling of broken stone. At the bottom it opened into the access tunnel the excavation team had carved into the original structure's outer wall, and from there into the corridor beyond. The corridor hit me first. I have been in large spaces. I grew up near the processing terminals on the Merv corridor, which are warehouse-sized structures built to handle bulk cargo at a scale that makes individual humans feel appropriately small. I have worked in Confederation garrison staging areas that could fit 3 city blocks under their rooflines. I have, in my professional capacity, walked through the holds of heavy freight carriers in the dark and felt the specific feeling that very large enclosed spaces produce in a human body. A slight pressure across the chest, a heightened awareness of one's own footsteps, a recalibration of scale. The corridor was 11 meters high and ran straight from the access breach to a set of doors that the archaeological team had already opened, pulled aside, somehow, on mechanisms that still worked after 14,000 years. It was lit by the expedition's portable arrays, which had been placed at intervals along the floor, and their light barely reached the ceiling. The glyph work on the walls was not merely decorative. I don't have the vocabulary to tell you exactly what it was, but looking at it, the density of it, the way it covered every surface without gap or repetition, the precision of every carved line. I felt the way I feel when I look at a very well-maintained manifest, where every line item is exactly where it should be and nothing is out of place. It had been made by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who were doing it with full intention, and who had done enough of it that they had no uncertainty left. I walked the corridor. My footsteps echoed. The air was cool and tasted faintly of something I couldn't name, not stale, not metallic, just different, like air that had been held in a closed space for so long that it had become its own thing. The doors were 3 meters thick, I noted in passing. The material they were made of was the same smooth, light-absorbing substance as the walls, and their edges, where they had been drawn back into recesses on either side of the doorframe, were still clean. No corrosion, no fracturing, no sealing compound from the expedition team, which meant they had opened on their own mechanisms and stayed open. Beyond them was the main chamber. I stopped at the threshold and looked at it for a while before I went in. The chamber was a hemisphere, or close enough that I couldn't see where the curve ended, and the flat walls began. The ceiling was higher than the corridor, high enough that the light arrays on the chamber floor didn't fully illuminate it, and it was covered in the same glyph work as the corridor, arranged in concentric rings from floor to apex. The chamber floor was a single continuous surface, smooth as the walls, with channels cut into it that radiated outward from the center like the lines on a compass rose. Following the channels, the platform. It was raised approximately a meter above the chamber floor. Its edges were clean geometric steps. The throne at its center was, as Save Madre had said, the obvious focal point of everything in the room, not because it was the largest thing, though it was substantial, 4 meters or more from the base of the seat to the top of the high, curved back, but because every channel in the floor, every glyph ring in the ceiling, every angle of the chamber walls was oriented toward it. The room was built to look at the throne. The room was built to understand that the throne was where authority sat. And it was dark. Not without light. The expedition arrays gave it a cold, even illumination that showed every surface clearly. But the throne itself absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, the same as the walls and floor, so it sat in the room like an object that existed at a slightly different level of reality than everything around it. It was present without shining. It occupied space without announcing itself. I had the odd and specific thought, standing at the threshold, that it was the most patient thing I had ever seen. I walked across the chamber floor. My footsteps sounded different here than in the corridor, flatter, more absorbed, as though the chamber was doing something to the sound. I reached the base of the platform steps and stopped. The throne was closer now. I could see the glyphwork on its surface clearly, dense, precise, uninterrupted, running from the base of the seat up the armrests and across the back of the chair in patterns that were similar to the wall glyphs but not identical. Where the wall glyphs had a quality I could only describe as archival records, documentation, the careful knotting of things, the glyphs on the throne's surface had a different quality. They were less like a record and more like a key. They were written for one purpose, and the purpose was activation. I stood there for 2 or 3 minutes just looking. I had not come here with any intention of doing anything. I am a logistics coordinator. I came because the shaft was open and the word waiting had been sitting in my mind for a day and a half, and I wanted to see the thing I'd been thinking about. I did not come to try to activate it. I did not come because I believed I was special or chosen or different from the 18-odd officers and researchers who had already come and gone without result. I came because I wanted to look at it. But the platform steps were right there, and the chamber was empty, and I am who I am, which is a person who, when presented with a discrepancy, follows it until she understands what happened. I stepped up onto the platform. The throne was even larger at close range. The armrests were at hip height from where I stood on the platform surface, which meant whoever was meant to sit in it was either considerably taller than me or was expected to be helped into it with some ceremony. The surface of the armrests was smooth in a way that all the surfaces in this place were smooth. Not the smoothness of machine-finished metal, but the smoothness of something that had been handled so many thousands of times that every rough edge had been worn away by contact, worn to fit the specific shape of hands that had rested on it. I was not trying to activate it. I want to be clear about that. I was stepping around the base of the throne, tracing the line of the glyphwork from the armrest down toward the base, trying to understand where one glyph ended and the next began. They flowed into each other the way a very long mathematical proof flows, each step requiring the one before it, and I put my right hand on the armrest to steady myself as I crouched to see the lower section more clearly. That is all. I put my hand on the armrest to steady myself as I crouched. The throne responded. Not explosively, not with a burst of light or a crack of sound or any of the dramatic ruptures you might expect when a thing that has been dormant for 14,000 years wakes up. It responded the way a very old and very certain machine responds to the correct input, smoothly, precisely, without surprise, because it had been waiting for this input and it was ready. The glyphs beneath my hand lit first, not with the cold light of the expedition arrays, but with something that had warmth in it, a deep, dark gold crimson, the color of coal that has been burning for a very long time, not orange bright but fully present, fully alive. The light spread from the point of my contact outward along the channels of the glyphwork, the way current spreads along a circuit, unhurried, reading each line before it moved to the next. I watched it travel up the armrest toward the back of the throne. I watched it reach the high carved back and begin to trace the glyph rings there, the ones I hadn't been able to see clearly from the platform floor, and I understood, watching it move, that it was reading the throne the same way I read a manifest, checking each entry, verifying that everything was in order, making sure. I did not move. I should note that. I did not remove my hand or step back or react in any way that could be described as panicked. I know myself well enough to know why, looking back. The throne was not threatening. Whatever this was, it was not aggressive. It had the same quality the room had: patience, certainty, the composure of something that has been very sure about what it was doing for a very long time. I stood where I was and watched it work and felt, somewhere in my chest, a resonance that was below the level of sound and above the level of feeling, and that I still don't have better words for than what I said then, to myself, in the empty chamber. It knows. The glyph light completed its circuit. The full surface of the throne was lit now, not blazing, not violent, but fully present, every line illuminated in that deep gold crimson, so that what had been a dark and absorbing surface was now a precisely lit record of intent, every character bright and clear and readable, if you had the language for it. Then the chamber changed. The channels in the floor, the ones radiating outward from the platform like compass lines, lit with the same light, and I understood in that moment that they were not decorative either. They were the throne's reach into the room, the lines along which it communicated with the walls and the ceiling, and as the channel light spread outward from the platform to the chamber edges, the glyphs on the walls began to come alive too, not all at once. In sequence, one ring at a time from the floor upward, the ceiling rings last, the same unhurried, systematic illumination, reading through everything, confirming the record, making sure that what it was about to do was consistent with the full archive of what it had been built to do. I stood on the platform with my hand on the armrest and watched a 14,000-year-old command chamber confirm its own integrity, and I felt, I want to be precise about this, I felt witnessed. Not surveilled, not analyzed, not threatened or tested or judged in the way that implies the possibility of failure. Witnessed, the way you feel when someone you trust sees you clearly and recognizes you, not for what you've done but for what you are. I had not felt that way many times in my life. I noted it. The ceiling rings completed. The full chamber was lit. Then the throne spoke. It was not a voice from a speaker. It was not a projection or a text display or any of the mediated forms of communication that we use between species and across distances. It was sound, air moved by a mechanism I couldn't locate, shaped into language that I had never heard before and could not have parsed as language, but that I heard completely, the way you hear a word in a dream in a language you don't know and understand it without being able to explain the understanding. 4 words. Not loud, not dramatic, not the proclamation of something that wanted to impress me. The tone of it was what I would call, if I had to call it something, the tone of a record being confirmed, settled, precise, factual. Blood of the first command. I stood very still. The glyph light on the armrest under my hand was warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, warm, the way a stone is warm after a full day of sun, a warmth that had been stored rather than generated, that was being released at a controlled rate. I was aware of it under my palm and through my fingertips, and I did not move my hand. Blood of the first command. I heard it again, not a second utterance, but a second layer of the first one, the way a very well-cut bell note reverberates in a stone room and you hear the first ring, and then the second ring that was always contained within it. The words settled into the air of the chamber and stayed there, not fatting, just becoming part of the room, the way a very true thing, once said, becomes part of the structure of the place where it was said. I stayed on the platform for a long time after that. The glyph light did not fade. The deep gold crimson stayed at full illumination. Every channel in the floor, every wall ring from the base to the ceiling, every line on the throne's surface and the warmth under my hand remained steady, not increasing or decreasing, not reacting to my stillness or my continued presence, simply present. The chamber had made its statement. It was not pressing me for anything further. It was simply lit, and warm, and ready, in the way that a room is ready when the person who belongs in it has arrived. I noticed things I hadn't noticed before now that there was more light. The ceiling glyph rings, lit now in the same gold crimson from their innermost circle to the apex, were arranged differently than the wall glyphs, not archival, not in the register of careful cataloging, but something more like a star chart, or a structural diagram, or a map of connections. I couldn't read them. I had no means to read them. But I could see that they were arranged by relationship rather than sequence, that each ring related to the rings above and below it rather than following a linear record, and that the outermost ring and the innermost ring were the same glyph repeated at very different scales. And that made a kind of sense I couldn't articulate except to say. The thing that holds the largest structure together is the same principle that holds the smallest structure together, and the room was built to say so. The channel light in the floor had a different quality than I'd noticed when it was spreading. Now that it had settled, now that the throne had completed its read and found everything in order, the channels glowed with something steadier and deeper than the initial illumination, a slow pulse, barely perceptible like a very slow heartbeat. Not mechanical. Alive was the wrong word, but it was the direction the word alive pointed toward, rhythmic, purposeful, running on something internal. I thought about the energy readings the survey team had mentioned. Consistent and stable. An active but dormant energy system. I thought about what kind of energy system runs for 14,000 years without depletion, without maintenance, without any input that the archaeological team had identified. And I thought about the fact that I was standing on a platform lit by that energy, and that it was warm to the touch, and that the warmth was stored rather than generated. I am not an engineer. I did not and could not resolve the physics of it, but I had spent enough years with supply manifests to understand the economics of it. You build a system that runs for 14,000 years only if you are very, very sure it will need to run for that long. You build that system only if you know, when you build it, that the resolution is not imminent, that the thing you're waiting for will take time, that the correct response to that knowledge is not to build a system that expires or degrades or requires maintenance, but to build one that simply continues, indefinitely, until the count comes right. That was planning. That was the long view. That was a civilization looking at itself honestly and asking, what do we owe the person who will come after us, after all the things that will happen between now and then, and how do we pay that debt across a distance of time that we cannot fully see? The answer they built was this room. I stood on the platform and let that understanding settle. There was something else, too, that I want to be precise about. The 4 words the throne had spoken were still present in the room. Not echoing, the chamber's acoustics were not reflective. The surfaces absorbed sound the way they absorbed light, but present in the sense of being available, the way a resonant frequency is available after the bell has stopped ringing, not as sound but as a potential for sound, a shape in the air that could reassemble if the right conditions returned. I did not hear them again. But I knew they were there the way I knew, sometimes, that a number in a manifest was wrong before I could identify the specific error. A presence, a weight. The fact of it. Blood of the first command. 4 words. A designation that reached back 14,000 years to a civilization whose name I did not know, whose language I could not speak, whose history had been entirely unknown to anyone I had ever met until 11 days ago, when a ground-penetrating scan came back with a shape that shouldn't have been there. A designation that had apparently been moving forward through the dark all that time, carried in the unremarkable bloodlines of unremarkable people doing unremarkable work, waiting for the day when it came close enough to this room for the room to recognize it. I did the arithmetic standing there on the platform. My mother, her mother's mother, and before that back and back, generation by generation, across 14,000 years. At a conservative estimate of 25 years per generation, that was 560 generations. 560 people who had carried this specific marker in their blood, most of whom would never have come anywhere near this planet, most of whom would have had no more idea that they were carrying anything significant than I had had. They had lived and worked and had children and passed the marker forward, not knowing, in the specific and ordinary way that most things of genuine importance are carried, without ceremony, without awareness, by people who were simply living their lives. And at the end of all those links in the chain, here I was, Grade 3 Logistics Coordinator, 31 years old, on an uninhabited rock in a survey deployment that was supposed to be a routine pre-settlement scan. I had the absurd and very clear thought, the manifest is accurate, every entry placed correctly, the count is right. Then I straightened up, took my hand off the armrest and stepped back. I need to tell you what I knew in that moment and what I didn't, because they are different things and they are both important. What I knew, the throne had been waiting, as the survey summary had suggested, with intent. What I knew, it had been through 18+ attempts by senior military officers and senior researchers and had not responded to any of them. What I knew, it had responded to me. What I knew, the phrase it had used was not a greeting or a title in the way that the civilian ranks I knew were titles, Grade 3 Logistics Coordinator, Commander, Colonel, but a designation of something older and more fundamental, something that reached into the structure of the person and named what was foundationally true about them. Blood, lineage, inheritance, the thing carried in the self that is not earned but given, passed down through the long unbroken thread of who begat whom. First command, not the garrison command structure I worked within, not Confederation command, not any of the institutional command layers I navigated daily. First, the origin, the point before which there was no prior point. What I did not know, why, not the mechanism, not the history, not the name of whoever had built this place, and built it to wait for the person who carried that specific designation in their blood, not the content of what I had inherited or what it meant I was now responsible for, not what first command was, specifically, in the 14,000-year context of this structure, and the civilization that had made it. What I knew and what I didn't know sat together on the platform in the warm glyph light, and I thought about them both with the same attention I give to a discrepancy in a manifest, and after a while I understood that this was exactly like a discrepancy in a manifest. There was a gap between the record, this ordinary woman, Grade 3, 31 years old, dry goods family, nothing distinguished, and the reading, blood of the first command, and the gap was not an error. The gap was the story. The gap was the thing that, followed correctly, would resolve into something that was true and complete, and that would make the rest of the numbers add up. I straightened up, I took my hand off the armrest. The throne light did not go out. I looked at that for a moment. It had lit when I touched it, and it was staying lit now that I had stopped touching it. That told me something about what kind of recognition this was. It was not proximity sensitive or contact dependent, the way a security system is. It was recognition of what I was, and what I was didn't change when I stepped back. The throne knew me. It would continue to know me whether I had my hand on it or not. I stepped down from the platform. I walked back across the chamber floor. I walked through the corridor. I climbed the ladder in the access shaft. I came out into the surface air of Orance Rock, which was thin and pale and cold, and smelled of turned rock and expedition equipment, and the particular blend of machine oil and compressed air recyclers that any garrison anywhere will always smell like, and I stood there for a while looking at the sky. The sky on Orance Rock was a deep steel blue, the kind of blue that a sky gets when there's no thick atmosphere to filter the light, when you're close enough to the edge of breathable air that you can feel, if you pay attention, the thinness of the protection between you and the cold. There were two of this system's planets visible even in the daytime. One a large pale shape near the horizon, one small and sharp overhead, and there was a layer of high cloud moving fast from the west, and I watched it move for a while. I thought about my mother and her supply route. I thought about my great-grandmother's name on a census form. I thought about the particular way women in my family had always worked, not at the front of things, not in the positions the records tend to notice, but in the positions that kept the records accurate, that made sure the right things were in the right place, that followed the thread of numbers until the discrepancy resolved. I thought about how much of what moves through the world is invisible to the people who study the world officially, how much of what holds things together is carried by the people who do the careful, unglamorous, meticulous work of making sure the count is right. And then I thought about a throne in a chamber 40 meters below my feet, built 14,000 years ago by people who knew enough to wait. I went back to my logistics office. I sat down at my terminal. I opened my manifest interface. I looked at the screen for a moment, and then I opened a new document, not a manifest, not a form, not a standardized report template, and I typed a heading. Personal Record, DOSI, Day 13, Orange Survey Deployment. I wrote down exactly what had happened, every detail. The access corridor, the shaft, the chamber, the throne, the glyph light in that deep gold crimson, the warmth under my hand, the 4 words. I wrote it the way I write everything, precisely in sequence, without editorializing, without any language I couldn't verify. I did not write that I felt chosen or significant or awed, because those words are imprecise and I had not verified them. I wrote what I had seen and heard and touched, and what the throne had said. When I finished, I read it back once. Then I secured the document under my personal access credentials and closed the terminal. Then I did the rest of the day's work. I need to tell you about the next morning, because the next morning is when it became real to me in the way that things need to become real before you can act on them. Not intellectually real, not recognized and filed real, but the kind of real that sits in your chest when you wake up and is still there when you've made your coffee and started your first manifest of the day. I woke up knowing what the throne had said, not remembering it, knowing it, the way you know your own name, the way you know the face of someone you love, without having to retrieve it from any stored location. It was present in the room with me before I was fully awake, and it was still present after I was fully awake, and I understood, lying on my bunk in the garrison habitat module in the thin, early light of Orange Rock's local dawn, that it was going to be present for the rest of my life. Blood of the first command. I lay there for a while, and I thought about what that meant. Not in the abstract philosophical sense. I would come to that later, in the months and years that followed, in conversations with historians and linguists and Confederation archivists who spent considerable time arguing about what the Vardy civilization's command structures had actually looked like, what the designation First Command referred to in their original context, what it meant that a bloodline carried it 14,000 years after the civilization itself had disappeared. There would be time for all of that. In the immediate sense. In the thin dawn on Orange Rock, with the pale, distant sun coming through the habitat module's narrow window, what I thought about was much simpler. Someone built that room. Someone built it to last 14,000 years. Someone built it with materials that still functioned, with mechanisms that still operated, with an energy system that was still running on whatever it ran on after all that time. Someone built it to wait. They built the walls to hold, the corridor to stand, the glyph work to remain legible, the throne to remain ready. They built all of that and then they left, or they ended, the way civilizations end, which is not the same as disappearing. And they left the room running, waiting for the day when the thread they had seeded would come back to it. That is not the work of a people who didn't know what they were doing. That is not the work of a civilization that didn't understand permanence, that didn't think carefully about what they left behind, that didn't take seriously the question of who would come after them and what those people would need. They thought about it, they built for it. They built a room that would outlast their language and their political structures and their physical presence and their entire historical record, built it to maintain itself through whatever came, built the mechanism of recognition deep enough in the artifact that it could find what it was looking for even after 14,000 years of accumulated change. Even in the blood of a woman who moved boxes on paper for a garrison survey crew, and whose great-grandmother's name appeared on a census form in a colony that hadn't existed yet when this room was made. They thought this through. That is, in the end, the thing that undid me. Not the recognition itself, not the warmth under my hand or the glyph light or the 4 words spoken in a language I had never heard and understood anyway. The thing that undid me was the consideration, the thought-through nature of it, the care. I sat up, I made my coffee, I started my first manifest. And I thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrives only after a night of real sleep and a morning of ordinary work, there are going to be things that need to be done. Not by me alone. I was very clear about that even then. I was a logistics coordinator, not a historian, not a linguist, not an engineer. I was not the right person to decode the glyph archive or restore the chamber's full infrastructure or contact whatever Confederation archaeological authority needed to be contacted. I was the right person to make sure the correct people were in the right place with the right information at the right time, and that the process of doing so didn't get tangled in the institutional friction that all such processes tend to generate when they're not managed carefully. That I could do. That I had been doing in one form or another my entire adult life. I filed my standard end-of-shift report. I updated the manifest discrepancy log with the lighting array correction from the previous day. I submitted the routine access log reconciliation. And then, at the end of my working day, I wrote a second document. This one was not personal. This one was a formal notification, filed through the standard garrison reporting channels, cross-copied to the Confederation Archaeological Survey's Field Command, and to the garrison's own operational review process. I wrote it in the standard format for field anomaly reports, because that is what it was, a documented anomaly in the site's response pattern, observed by a credentialed garrison personnel member during authorized site access, requiring review. I stated what I had observed. I stated when and how I had accessed the site. I stated what the artifact had done. I stated what it had said. I stated it all precisely, without elaboration or interpretation, in the language of a field report, which is the language of someone who trusts the record to do the work. I submitted it, and then I went to the mess hall and had dinner, and I sat with Save Madre and 2 of the engineering technicians from the garrison's infrastructure team, and we talked about the local geology and the likelihood of the mining consortium's license application being approved, and nobody said anything about the chamber, and I did not say anything about it either. By the next morning, the notification had moved up 3 levels of the Archaeological Survey's command chain, and the garrison's commanding officer had requested a meeting with me for the following day. That meeting was not what I had expected. The garrison's commanding officer was a woman named Brigadier Sandavrays. She was in her early 50s, a survey and infrastructure specialist who had overseen 5 major dig deployments before this one, none of which had produced anything more significant than some well-preserved pre-colonial construction. She read my field notification back to me from her terminal when I came into her office, not because she thought I'd forgotten what I'd written, but because she wanted to establish carefully that she was working from the document rather than from rumor. She was that kind of officer, someone who cleared the ground before she built on it. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "You filed this under field anomaly." I said yes. She said, "It's more than a field anomaly." I said, "I filed what I could document. The rest is interpretation." She considered that. She received information and let it settle before she responded. Another thing I had noted about her in the weeks prior, the quality of someone who had been burned by premature conclusions early in a career and had trained themselves out of it. She said, "The research team has been trying to activate that throne for 9 days." I said I knew. She said, "They're going to want to talk to you." I said I was available. She looked at me for another moment and then she asked a question that surprised me because it was not the operational or security question I had expected. She asked, "Are you all right?" I thought about that genuinely. I said, "Yes, I think so. I need more information before I'm sure, but what I observed was not distressing. It was very calm." She nodded. She said, "If that changes, tell me." I said I would. She told me I had done the right thing filing it formally and immediately. She said it with the specific emphasis that experienced officers give to procedural compliance when what they mean is, you kept this from becoming a problem by handling it correctly. I filed the meeting in my personal record that evening alongside the initial event documentation. The research team's interview with me lasted 4 hours. It was conducted by the Archaeological Survey's lead field researcher, a methodical man named Dr. Penn Colt, and 2 of his senior colleagues. They were thorough without being aggressive, curious without being credulous, and they asked their questions in a sequence that told me they had prepared carefully. They started with the purely observational, what I saw, when, in what order, at what level of light, what was the sound quality, what was the tactile quality, and moved gradually toward the interpretive, and they were careful at each step to distinguish between what I had directly observed and what I was inferring. I answered them the way I answer every professional inquiry, precisely, with the same language I had used in my written documentation, without embellishment or speculation beyond what the observation directly supported. Dr. Colt asked me at one point whether I had felt during the activation that the throne was communicating with me or processing me. I thought about the distinction. I said, both, but sequentially. It processed first. I could follow that in the glyphlight's movement through the surface, the systematic check of each section, the reading before the response. Communication came after the processing was complete. He wrote that down and read it back to me and asked if I stood by it. I said yes. He asked whether the warmth I described had felt localized to the contact point or distributed. I said localized first, then distributed, like a circuit completing. He wrote that down too. At the end of the interview, he said, "I want to be transparent with you about where we are scientifically. We have no prior documented instance of an artifact of this age responding to a specific genetic marker at this degree of specificity. We have theoretical models that accommodate it, but they've never been empirically tested. What you observed is, as far as our research record goes, unprecedented." I thanked him for saying so. He said, "We'd like to bring you back into the chamber with a full monitoring suite." I said I was available. He said, "The monitoring suite will be fairly extensive, about 20 individual sensors and a full imaging array." I said that was fine. I said, "I'd like the monitoring reports when they're complete." He looked at me for a moment and then he said, "Of course." I believe he had not expected me to ask for them. Most of the people who pass through research processes in field deployments do not ask for the data. I find this puzzling. The data is about them, but I did not say that. By the end of that week, there were 17 additional researchers on site. By the end of the following month, the Vardy's command chamber, they named it that officially, I had nothing to do with the naming, was the subject of a full-scale Confederation Archaeological Commission review, with a research budget that was, as far as I could tell from the supply manifests, approximately 40 times the original survey budget. I continued to process the manifests. I continued to file the reconciliation reports. I went back into the chamber 11 more times over the course of that deployment, always during the quiet hours, always alone. Each time, the throne lit when I stepped onto the platform. Each time I stood on the platform for a while and thought, and sometimes I put my hand on the armrest and sometimes I didn't. The glyph light was always the same, deep gold crimson, warm, unhurried, reading each line before it moved to the next. The researchers wanted to understand the mechanism by which it recognized me. That was, understandably, their primary scientific interest. They ran extensive biological and genetic scans. They mapped markers they called archaic sequences in my genetic profile that were, in their assessment, significantly older than the surrounding population of sequences, as though certain portions of my coding had been transcribed from a very old original and passed forward with unusual fidelity. They argued about what this meant and what the original source might have been. They produced reports. They requested follow-up studies. They were, in the way of researchers who have found something genuinely significant, very excited and very careful and very slow. I let them work. I answered their questions accurately when they asked them. I signed the consent documents for the genetic studies, and I did my job, which remained what it had always been, making sure the right things were in the right place at the right time and that the count was accurate. At the end of the 3rd month, Colonel Harvin asked to meet with me. It was not the first time we had met officially. The notification process had required several meetings with Garrison Command, all of which had been professional and properly documented. But this meeting was different. He requested it outside official channels. A request passed through the informal Garrison communication network that senior officers sometimes use when they want to talk without generating a formal record. I went to his office at the time he suggested. He had the air of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had decided he was going to say it plainly rather than continue not saying it. He asked me to sit down. He said he had tried the throne himself on day 7 for 4 hours. He did not say this apologetically or defensively. He said it as a fact, the way he said most things. He said it didn't respond. I said no. He said, I've read the research team's preliminary report on your genetic profile. I said I knew. He looked at me for a moment. He was not a man who was easily read. His face gave away very little, but there was something in it that I recognized, because I had felt it myself in the thin dawn light on the morning after, lying on my bunk and knowing, before I was fully awake, what the throne had said. He said, "What does it feel like?" I thought about that. I thought about it carefully, because it was the first time anyone had asked me that specific question, and Harvin was not the kind of man who asked careless questions. I said, like a discrepancy that resolved. He looked at me for another moment. Then he nodded, not in the way that means I agree with you or I understand what you mean, but in the way that means I know exactly what that is, and I will not ask you to say more about it than that. We sat in his office for a few more minutes. He told me that the Confederation Commission had approved a permanent research posting at the Vardy site, and that garrison support would be extended indefinitely. He told me that my deployment orders were being reviewed at regional command level, and that there was a question about whether my continued presence at the site was categorized as logistics support, research support, or something else. He said, "What do you want it to be?" I said I wasn't sure yet. I said I thought I needed to understand more before I decided. He said, "That's the right answer." I believe he meant it. There is a question I have been asked many times since, in many different forms, by many different people in many different professional and personal contexts, and I want to answer it here because I have not given a complete answer to it anywhere else. The question is, are you afraid? People ask it in different registers. The researchers ask it clinically. Does the artifact's response produce anxiety? Does the sense of hereditary designation create psychological distress? Has the experience affected your functional capacity? The garrison personnel ask it more directly, the way soldiers ask things. Are you scared of what it means? My mother asked it in her own way, when I finally told her, months later, over a long-distance call that took 4 minutes each way to reach her on the Merv corridor. She went quiet for a long time, and then she said, very carefully, Is this the kind of thing you can walk away from if you need to? The answer to all of them, for all the different versions of the question, is the same. No. Not because I am particularly brave or particularly certain or particularly equipped to carry whatever this turns out to mean. I am a logistics coordinator. I am not anyone's idea of a chosen hero. I am not particularly strong or particularly wise or particularly anything, except meticulous, and meticulous is not a quality that anyone builds monuments to. But no, because when I stood on that platform with the throne light reading through the glyph work and the warmth under my hand, and the deep settled certainty of a machine that had been waiting for a very long time, and had finally found what it was waiting for, when I stood there and heard 4 words in a language I had never learned and understood them completely, what I felt was not fear. What I felt was the way a number feels when it finally adds up. The count was right. After 14,000 years, the count was right, and the record was complete, and all the lines added up, and whatever discrepancy had been sitting in the archive since the civilization that built this room ended, since the last person who carried this specific designation died or left or was lost, that discrepancy was resolved. Not by anything I chose, not by anything I earned, by something I carried in the deep archaic sequences of my genetic profile, in the long unbroken thread of women who kept the count accurate and passed something forward without knowing what it was, in my great-grandmother's name on a census form, in my mother's hands on a supply route, in mine on a keyboard. Something that had been moving forward through the dark for 14,000 years, patient as a stone, certain as arithmetic. I am not afraid of it. I am, if anything, the one thing I can say with complete accuracy. I am the right person for it. Not because I am extraordinary, because I am precisely what was needed, carried precisely as far as it needed to come, arriving in exactly the form the throne was built to recognize. That is the conclusion I reached, in the month of work and thought and careful documentation that followed. That is the conclusion I have not revised in the years since. The dead are not always finished. Sometimes they are waiting. Sometimes they built everything they needed to build, seeded everything they needed to seed, and then they simply held the door open and trusted that the count would come right eventually. It came right. I am the count. I know what to do with that.